The morning fog still clung to the surface of Silverbrook Creek as Michael Thompson made his way down the well-worn path from his backyard. Waders pulled high, sample kit in hand. He'd followed this same Friday routine for nearly a decade since purchasing his ranch-style home in the Whispering Pines community. The creek wasn't just water flowing through his property. It was his sanctuary, his purpose. Michael carefully waded to midstream, watching the gentle ripples around his legs. As an environmental scientist specializing in aquatic ecosystems, he knew this creek contained secrets most of his neighbors couldn't see: microhabitats supporting endangered species, delicate ecological balances, and most importantly, one of the last viable spawning grounds for the threatened cove salmon in the region. "Morning, Dr. Thompson," called Eleanor Davis from her deck 2 houses down. The retired biology teacher often joined him for educational creek walks. "How are our little swimmers doing?" "Early counts look promising, Eleanor," Michael replied, carefully extracting water samples. "The restoration work is finally paying off. The juvenile numbers are up 20% from last year." His phone buzzed. A text from his colleague at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Latest satellite imagery confirms Silverbrook is now the most productive coho tributary in the county. The feds are taking notice. Keep up the amazing work. Michael smiled, slipping the phone back into his waterproof case. 7 years of volunteer monitoring, countless weekend restoration projects, and painstaking documentation had transformed what was once a degraded stream into a wildlife success story. The previous HOA board had even recognized his efforts with a Community Stewardship Award, installing educational placards along the creek trail that highlighted the waterway's protected status and ecological significance. As he recorded measurements in his waterproof notebook, Michael noticed a luxury SUV pulling up to the vacant home across the creek, the Henderson's place that had been on the market for months. A striking woman in designer outdoor wear emerged, followed by a real estate agent frantically trying to keep pace. Michael watched as the woman gestured dismissively toward the creek, her voice carrying across the water. "All this natural area looks completely unkempt. Is there any plan to clean it up? It's practically a swamp." The agent's placating response was inaudible, but Michael felt a familiar unease. He'd heard similar sentiments before from new residents who viewed the delicate ecosystem as messy and in need of improvement. Usually, a friendly conversation and one of his creek ecology tours changed their perspective. Little did Michael know that Elaine Winters, the woman now surveying the creek with obvious distaste, would soon become not just his new neighbor, but a force that would threaten everything he'd worked to protect. The Whispering Pines Community Center buzzed with an unusual energy for a monthly HOA meeting. Michael slipped into a seat in the back row, nodding to familiar faces. Attendance had nearly doubled since the announcement that Harold Jenkins, their longtime HOA president, was stepping down due to health concerns. "I'm telling you, she's bought 3 investment properties in Oak Ridge Estates and completely transformed their community guidelines," whispered Diane from 2 doors down, leaning toward her husband. "My sister lives there, says everything's beige and controlled now." Michael was about to ask who they were discussing when the room hushed. Harold Jenkins stood, leaning slightly on his cane. "After 15 wonderful years serving this community, it's time for new leadership," he announced with visible emotion. "I'm pleased to introduce your newly elected HOA president, Elaine Winters." The woman from the creek viewing strode confidently to the podium in a tailored blazer, pearl necklace catching the fluorescent lights. Michael recognized her immediately, that sense of unease returning stronger than before. "Whispering Pines has such potential," Elaine began, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "But frankly, certain areas have become neglected. Our property values could be significantly higher with proper management and aesthetic improvements." For the next 45 minutes, Elaine presented a sleek PowerPoint outlining her Whispering Pines Renewal Initiative. The community sat in growing discomfort as she detailed new paint color restrictions, landscaping requirements, and common area enhancements. When she reached a slide titled Waterway Beautification Project, Michael sat up straighter. The creek area, while charming in concept, has become overgrown and unsightly, Elaine declared, clicking to a photo deliberately taken at the creek's least flattering angle. We'll be installing decorative wrought iron fencing with controlled access points, removing the unsightly vegetation, and creating proper water features that enhance rather than detract from our community's appearance. Michael's hand shot up. Elaine's eyes narrowed slightly before acknowledging him. That unsightly vegetation is native riparian habitat supporting endangered species, Michael explained, keeping his voice measured despite his racing heart. Silverbrook is designated as critical habitat under federal protection. Any modifications require environmental impact studies and— "Thank you for your enthusiasm," Elaine interrupted, her smile tightening. "But this community makes decisions as a whole, not based on individual hobbies or interests. The board has reviewed and approved these improvements." Michael looked around at the board, 3 new faces he'd never seen at meetings before, all nodding in agreement with Elaine. He noticed they all lived in the northern section of the development, the area furthest from the creek and least affected by any changes to it. "I don't believe we've had proper community input on this," Michael persisted, "and there are legal considerations regarding protected waterways that—" "We've already secured the necessary approvals," Elaine cut in again, her tone final. "The beautification begins next week. Now, moving on to the revised parking regulations." After the meeting, Michael approached Elaine with his business card extended. "I work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'd be happy to share the ecological surveys and legal designations for the creek before you proceed." Elaine glanced at the card without taking it. "Mr. Thompson, the decisions have been made. I understand change can be difficult, but I assure you these improvements will benefit everyone's property values." She turned to greet another resident, effectively dismissing him. As Michael walked home in the gathering dusk, his phone lit up with texts from concerned neighbors who'd witnessed the exchange. The creek gurgled peacefully beside the path, unaware of the battle now brewing over its future. Michael had been gone just 3 days, a mandatory department conference in Seattle, but as he turned onto Creekside Lane, he knew immediately something was wrong. The familiar view of dappled water through the trees was obstructed by something dark and rigid. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. Construction crews in high-visibility vests swarmed the creek's edge, and the harsh metallic sound of grinding metal pierced the air. A 6-foot wrought iron fence was being installed along both sides of Silverbrook Creek, cutting directly through what had been accessible community green space for decades. Michael parked haphazardly and jogged toward the nearest worker. "Excuse me, what's happening here?" "HOA improvement project," the foreman replied without looking up from his clipboard. "Should be done by tomorrow." Heart pounding, Michael followed the fence line to where it crossed his property's back boundary. A heavy gate now blocked his creek access path, secured with an electronic keypad. He punched in his community gate code, denied. He tried again, denied. His phone was out immediately, dialing the HOA office. "Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. This is Jessica." "This is Michael Thompson on Creekside Lane. There's been a mistake. There's a locked gate blocking access to the creek behind my house." "Oh, Mr. Thompson." "Yes, the new access policy was outlined in the community email sent yesterday. Creek access now requires special permission through the electronic system. You'll need to submit a formal request through the resident portal." "A request? To access my own property line?" "The creek and a 10-foot margin on either side are actually common property according to the community plat maps," Jessica recited, clearly reading from prepared text. "The board has determined that controlled access is necessary for safety and aesthetic consistency." Michael ended the call and immediately emailed Elaine, copying the entire board. He outlined the legal issues with blocking access to a federally protected waterway and requested immediate restoration of access for environmental monitoring purposes. He attached links to the relevant wildlife protection statutes. No response came that day, or the next. His follow-up calls went to voicemail. When he submitted an access request through the portal, it remained pending review. On the 3rd day, Michael spotted Elaine at the community pool surrounded by her north side neighbors. Swallowing his growing anger, he approached with forced civility. "Elaine, I've been trying to reach you about the creek access. I have legal monitoring responsibilities that I can't fulfill with the gates installed." Elaine lowered her designer sunglasses. "Mr. Thompson, your persistence is becoming disruptive. The creek runs through HOA common property. We decide who accesses it and when. Your scientific hobby doesn't give you special privileges." The women around her nodded in agreement, one of them adding, "The creek was always so messy. The fence makes everything look so much cleaner." "It's not about appearances," Michael said, struggling to keep his voice level. "It's a protected salmon habitat with federal oversight. This isn't just an HOA matter. I've consulted with our attorney, and he assures me we're well within our rights," Elaine replied dismissively. "If you continue this harassment, we'll be forced to take action. Now, if you'll excuse us, we're discussing the spring garden tour." As Michael walked away, he heard one of the women whisper, "So dramatic about a little creek. Doesn't he know property values have already jumped 3% since Elaine took over?" That evening, standing at his kitchen window overlooking the now inaccessible creek, Michael watched a family of river otters struggle to navigate their usual path, confused by the new barriers. His decade of careful work was being undone by ignorance and aesthetics. He reached for his phone again, but not to call the HOA. This time, he dialed his department supervisor at Fish and Wildlife. "You're not going to believe this, Lisa," Michael said, spreading satellite maps across his supervisor's desk the next morning. "They fenced off the entire creek corridor without a single permit or environmental review." Lisa Chen, Regional Director of Endangered Species Protection at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, studied the before and after photos Michael had taken. 20 years of government service had left her unflappable in the face of environmental violations, but even she raised an eyebrow. "This is one of our critical habitat zone designations," she confirmed, pulling up the department's GIS system. "Silverbrook received federal protection status 3 years ago after your documentation of spawning pairs exceeded threshold numbers." She zoomed in on Michael's neighborhood. "The electronic boundary markers are clear. Your FOA has constructed barriers directly through a Tier 1 protected watershed. That's not just a local code violation. It potentially violates the Endangered Species Act and Clean Water Act provisions." The office door opened as James Whitford, the department's legal counsel, joined them. Lisa had called him the moment Michael explained the situation. "How long has access been restricted?" James asked, already taking notes. 5 days now. I've missed 2 critical water quality sampling dates and the spawning count that was scheduled for yesterday." James winced. Interfering with mandated environmental monitoring is a separate violation. Did they file any impact statements or alternative monitoring plans? "Nothing," Michael confirmed. "The HOA president explicitly told me the creek access is now at the board's discretion, regardless of monitoring requirements." Lisa and James exchanged glances. "This is straightforward from a legal perspective," James said. "The department has primary jurisdiction through the critical habitat designation. The question is how we approach enforcement." "I prefer to resolve this without immediately escalating to federal involvement," Michael admitted. "These are my neighbors, and many probably don't understand what they've approved." Lisa nodded thoughtfully. "Start with formal documentation. We'll prepare an official letter outlining the protected status and regulatory requirements." "Sometimes education is enough. And if it's not?" Michael asked. James closed his notebook. "Then we move to enforcement. Fines start at $50,000 per day for willful interference with protected habitat. But let's try the gentle approach first." As Michael drove home, a certified letter from the Department of Fish and Wildlife in the passenger seat, he noticed new landscapers removing native plants along the creek's edge, replacing them with non-native ornamental species that provided none of the necessary shade or insect habitat the salmon required. He parked at home and walked to the fence line, where the water temperature monitor was now showing readings 2 degrees higher than normal, a potentially fatal increase for sensitive fish eggs. Through the fence bars, he could see silt from the landscaping work clouding the previously clear water. The certified letter suddenly felt inadequate against the ecological damage already unfolding. Michael hand-delivered the department's official letter to the HOA office 3 days later, ensuring Jessica signed for it. The 9-page document meticulously outlined Silverbrook Creek's protected status, included copies of the federal designation maps, relevant environmental regulations, and a clear explanation of the monitoring requirements being obstructed by the new fencing. The letter concluded with a respectful but firm request: remove the fences within 7 days, restore access for mandated monitoring, and consult with the department before any further modifications to the riparian zone. Jessica, please make sure every board member receives a copy, Michael said. This is extremely important. I'll make sure they get it, she promised, looking uncomfortable. But between us, Mr. Thompson, Ms. Winters doesn't take criticism well. Michael nodded. This isn't criticism. It's a legal requirement. The creek isn't just pretty scenery. It's a protected ecosystem. Walking home, Michael felt cautiously optimistic. Surely once the board understood the legal implications, they'd reconsider. Maybe this had all been an unfortunate misunderstanding. His optimism lasted exactly 3 days. The certified letter arrived by courier, the return address showing the prestigious downtown law firm that represented the HOA. Michael's hands shook slightly as he signed for it, the courier avoiding eye contact. Inside, on heavy letterhead, was a cease and desist letter that made his blood run cold. Dear Mr. Thompson, this firm represents the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. It has come to our attention that you have engaged in a pattern of harassment against the board of directors, including but not limited to spreading misinformation designed to undermine community governance, making false claims regarding waterway jurisdiction, and attempting to usurp the authority of duly elected community representatives. Your actions constitute a violation of Community Covenant Section 8.3, prohibiting activities that disrupt community harmony and governance. The board is currently considering appropriate fines for these violations. Furthermore, your attempts to involve government agencies through misrepresentation of facts constitutes a potential violation of Section 12.1 requiring members to act in good faith regarding community matters. You are hereby ordered to cease all communication regarding creek access and management with the board, individual board members, and any government agencies in your capacity as a resident. Any legitimate concerns must be submitted in writing through appropriate channels during designated comment periods. Failure to comply will result in legal action against you personally, including but not limited to financial penalties, liens against your property, and potential litigation for damages to community reputation and property values. Sincerely, Bradford Wellington I.Lee, Esquire, Wellington, Pierce and Associates. Michael read the letter twice, his scientist's mind cataloging each falsehood and misrepresentation with clinical precision, even as anger rose in his chest. They hadn't just ignored the federal protection notice. They were threatening him for bringing it to their attention. As if on cue, his phone chimed with an email notification from the HOA portal. Access request denied. Your request for creek access has been reviewed and denied due to pattern of disruptive behavior and misuse of common areas. You may reapply in 90 days pending good standing status. Through his kitchen window, Michael could see a water testing station he'd installed being removed by maintenance workers. Across the creek, a resident walking too close to the fence was being approached by a newly hired community compliance officer in a crisp uniform. The warning shot had been fired. The LOA wasn't just ignoring federal protections. They were actively retaliating against the messenger. Michael carefully placed the threatening letter in a folder with his other documentation. His scientist's methodical nature had always served him well in field research. Now it would serve a different purpose. He picked up his phone and dialed James Whitford's direct line. They've escalated, he said simply when the attorney answered. I think it's time for the less gentle approach. The unmarked government SUVs began arriving at 8:15 a.m. on a Wednesday, a deliberate time when most residents would be witnessing the spectacle as they left for work. Michael watched from his front porch as officials in jackets emblazoned with different agency logos assembled in the community center parking lot. 4 departments had coordinated their response: Fish and Wildlife, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Army Corps of Engineers, who had jurisdiction over waterways, and the state's Department of Environmental Conservation. It was an impressive show of bureaucratic force, exactly as James had promised. The multi-agency approach sends a message, James had explained during their planning call. It's also harder for them to dismiss or intimidate multiple federal and state authorities simultaneously. Elaine's luxury SUV screeched into the lot 15 minutes later. Michael could see her gesticulating wildly as James calmly handed her a thick stack of documents, official notices of violation from each agency, along with inspection warrants that didn't require her permission. Neighbors gathered in small clusters along the street, watching with growing concern as officials and waiters began documenting conditions along the creek, photographing the fencing, testing water quality, and marking areas of disturbance with bright orange flags. Each flag represented a separate potential violation. Michael's phone buzzed constantly with texts from neighbors. What's happening? Are we in trouble? Why are the feds here? He responded to each with the same careful message. Federal inspection of Silverbrook Creek's protected habitat status. Community meeting tonight at 7 p.m. for information. By noon, the orange violation flags numbered in the dozens. Officials had documented the unauthorized fencing, removed native vegetation, introduced invasive ornamental species, increased water temperature from reduced shade, siltation from landscaping, and most seriously, the blocked access that had prevented mandated endangered species monitoring. Michael's doorbell rang at 2 p.m. He opened it to find Diane and several other neighbors on his porch, faces drawn with worry. My husband says we could be fined thousands, Diane said without preamble. Is that true? The potential fines are substantial, Michael acknowledged, inviting them in. Silverbrook is federally protected habitat. The agencies are documenting violations that occurred when the creek was altered without permits or environmental review. But we voted for beautification, another neighbor protested, not violations. Nobody told us about any endangered species. Michael pulled out the community newsletter from 3 years ago, the one featuring his work and announcing the creek's federal designation, complete with a photo of Elaine accepting a copy at her home closing the previous year. Oh God, Diane whispered, we didn't know. The board just said we were improving the community's appearance. There's a community meeting tonight, Michael assured them. The officials will explain everything. This isn't about punishing residents. It's about protecting the habitat. As his neighbors left, Michael noticed Elaine watching from her vehicle parked down the street, her expression thunderous. By evening, the community center overflowed with anxious residents. Michael sat quietly in the back as James Whitford and representatives from each agency explained the situation. The projector displayed standing before and after images of the creek alterations alongside maps of the protected habitat designation. The violations documented today carry potential fines exceeding $50,000 per day, James explained calmly. Additionally, restoration requirements will be substantial. The room erupted in shocked exclamations. However, James continued once the noise subsided. The agencies recognized that many community members were likely unaware of the creek's protected status. Our focus is on habitat restoration, not punitive measures, provided the violations are addressed promptly. A hand shot up from the front row. Who pays these fines? The HOA. That means all of us through our dues. Typically, yes, the EPA representative confirmed. Although if we find evidence that individuals knowingly violated federal protections, liability could be assigned more specifically. All eyes turned to the board table, where Elaine sat rigidly between her attorney and the remaining board members, who were now visibly distancing themselves from her. Did the board know? Someone called out. Did you know it was protected when you approved this? Elaine's attorney whispered urgently in her ear, but she brushed him off, standing to address the room. We made aesthetic improvements to increase property values, she declared. If some bureaucratic red tape was overlooked in the process, that's hardly overlooked, interrupted an elderly resident, waving the 3-year-old newsletter with Michael's Creek protection announcement. It was announced in our own community publication. The room descended into chaos as residents began shouting questions and accusations. The property manager frantically called for order. In the midst of the uproar, Michael received a text from James. Meeting with agencies tomorrow, 9 a.m. Bring your restoration plan. This community will need your help navigating out of this mess. Michael looked around at his angry, frightened neighbors. They had been misled by someone who valued aesthetics over ecology, property values over environmental protection. Now they were facing the consequences and would need a path forward. The emergency HOA meeting stretched past midnight, a marathon of revelations and recriminations that transformed the community in real time. Michael watched from the back row as his neighbors underwent a collective awakening to the environmental and financial disaster unfolding around them. The OA's financial advisor had been called in to present the stark reality. If the full fines were assessed, they would exceed the association's total reserves by more than 300%. Each household would face special assessments of approximately $15,000 to cover the penalties, plus ongoing increased dues to fund the required restoration work. Property values won't matter if we're all bankrupt, muttered Robert Chen, the normally quiet accountant from Willow Court, loud enough for everyone to hear. As the magnitude of the situation became clear, the community's focus shifted from shock to accountability. Elaine's carefully cultivated base of support evaporated as residents connected the dots between her beautification campaign and their potential financial ruin. You assured us all necessary approvals were in place, accused Caroline Weber, who had initially supported the Creek project. You specifically said when Michael raised concerns that you had secured the necessary approvals. That was clearly untrue. Elaine's composure finally cracked. I was trying to improve this community. The creek was an eyesore with all those weeds and rough areas. Every modern development has controlled waterscapes, not wild, unkempt streams. Those weeds were native riparian vegetation critical for salmon spawning. Michael finally spoke up, his voice steady. The roughed areas were microhabitats supporting endangered species. What looked messy to you was actually a perfectly balanced ecosystem. The room fell silent as he continued, I understand wanting to improve our community, but real improvement would have been working with nature, not against it. Learning about the creek, not controlling it. The HOA attorney cleared his throat uncomfortably. In light of tonight's disclosures, I must advise the board that the association's insurance will likely not cover violations that occurred with prior knowledge of protected status. The fiduciary duty to the community was compromised when documented federal designations were disregarded. One by one, the remaining board members distanced themselves from Elaine's decisions. By midnight, motions had passed to immediately remove all creek fencing and restore monitoring access. Request Michael's assistance in developing a habitat restoration plan. Create a new environmental compliance committee. Accept Elaine's resignation, effective immediately. As the meeting adjourned, shell-shocked residents lingered in small groups, processing the evening's events. Michael found himself surrounded by neighbors who had barely spoken to him before. Could you show us what the creek is supposed to look like? Asked a young mother who had moved in just months ago. I want my kids to understand why it matters. I had no idea endangered salmon spawned here, admitted another resident. That's actually pretty cool. My sister's HOA in Phoenix got into similar trouble over desert tortoise habitat, shared an elderly gentleman. Took them years to recover financially. We need to get this right. The next morning, Michael led a group of agency officials and newly elected interim board members on a creek assessment walk. Where just days before he had been threatened with legal action for discussing the creek's protected status, he was now being asked to explain every detail of the ecosystem's needs. The salmon require cool, oxygen-rich water, he explained, pointing to areas where removed vegetation had already increased water temperatures. The native plants provide shade and habitat for insects that are part of the food chain. Everything is connected. The EPA representative nodded. Your restoration plan will need to address all these components. The good news is, with prompt action, we can likely mitigate most of the damage. As they walked, residents emerged from homes along the creek, curious and concerned. Many joined the procession, asking questions and offering help. By the time they completed the creek assessment, The improvised tour had grown to over 30 people. "I can organize volunteer teams for the replanting," offered the Community Garden Club president. "Just tell us what needs to go where." "My environmental law class would love to document the restoration process," said a college professor who had recently moved to the community. "It could be a case study in community-based environmental recovery." Standing on the bridge overlooking the creek, Michael watched a pair of river otters cautiously returning to their disrupted territory. Something was shifting in Whispering Pines, something more significant than the environmental restoration now underway. The community itself was awakening to its connection with the natural world flowing literally through its heart. 6 months later, Michael stood ankle-deep in Silverbrook Creek, surrounded by neighbors in borrowed waders. What had begun as an environmental catastrophe had transformed into something unexpected, a community united by a shared purpose. "Careful with those willow stakes," he called to a group of teenagers planting along the bank. "They need to be at least 2/3 buried to root properly." The creek restoration had become Whispering Pines' largest community project in its history. Where Elaine's fence once stood, native plants now flourished in carefully designed riparian buffers. The water flowed clear again, temperatures returned to appropriate levels, and water quality measurements showed steady improvement. Most remarkably, the community that had once been largely indifferent to the creek now embraced it as their collective responsibility. Weekend volunteer events regularly drew 50 or more residents. The community newsletter now featured a monthly creek health report. Children from the neighborhood had started a Salmon Guardians Club that monitored wildlife sightings. The legal resolution had been more positive than anyone expected. When the community demonstrated immediate and comprehensive corrective action under Michael's guidance, the agencies had agreed to reduce the fines substantially. The remaining penalties were directed toward funding an expanded restoration that included educational components and long-term monitoring infrastructure. Elaine had moved away shortly after her resignation, selling her home to a young family who were now among the most enthusiastic creek volunteers. The legal fallout continued for her personally. The Evoways Insurance Company was pursuing action against her for approving the project despite documented knowledge of the protected status. "Michael, come quick," called Eleanor Davis from upstream. "They're here." Michael and several neighbors hurried to where Eleanor stood, pointing excitedly at the creek bed. In the clear water, they could see them, the unmistakable forms of returning coho salmon, their bodies turned bright red in spawning coloration, fighting their way upstream. This year's run was larger than any Michael had documented in his decade of monitoring. Residents gathered along the banks, phones recording the salmon's powerful struggle against the current. Children watched wide-eyed as nature's ancient cycle played out before them. "I never thought I'd be excited about fish," admitted Robert Chen, the accountant who had emerged as the new HOA president. "But knowing these guys traveled thousands of miles in the ocean just to return to our creek, it's pretty amazing." The following week, at a ceremony attended by most of the community, state environmental officials unveiled a new sign at the creek's main crossing. "Silverbrook Creek, critical coho salmon habitat, protected by federal designation and community stewardship." Below the official text, a second plaque had been added. "The Whispering Pines community acknowledges our responsibility as guardians of this water for generations to come." As residents gathered for a celebration picnic afterward, Michael found himself approached by a reporter from the local newspaper. "I understand you're the one who fought to protect this creek," she began. "How does it feel to see the community embrace your cause?" Michael considered the question as he looked around at children playing a salmon migration game, retired residents discussing native plant identification, and neighbors who had once been strangers now working side by side. "It was never just my cause," he replied finally. "The creek belongs to all of us, and to something much larger than us. I think what you're seeing isn't people embracing my vision, but discovering their own connection to this ecosystem. Once you see that connection, you can't unsee it." That evening, as the community gathering wound down, Michael stood alone on the footbridge watching the last light play on the water. The legal battle was over, the creek was healing, and something profound had shifted in Whispering Pines. A splash below caught his attention. A large coho salmon leaping upstream, its determination a testament to nature's resilience. Michael smiled. Some victories weren't measured in court decisions or policy changes, but in clear running water and the return of creatures who had no concept of property values or aesthetic standards, only home. The creek flowed on, oblivious to the human drama that had threatened it, now safeguarded not just by federal designation, but by an awakened community that had learned, through crisis, to see the true value of what had been in their backyards all along.